Welcome to this commented time lapse of the drawing of Ichiko. This is a demo of a schoolgirl. You can see me starting right out there with the proportions, measuring the proportions out and getting in the forms, the dynamic shapes and dynamic forms, and building out the character. Of course, when you're doing manga style, proportions and the stylistic elements are everything. It really is a nuanced style. It doesn't have set rules for everything. Some things bend the rules, like the eyes being graphics, more like graphics and stickers than 3D forms, like the mouths also being more like graphics than 3D forms, but of course only in some instances where the mouth can sometimes be 3D extreme side views. So very much a nuanced style. And I've done this sort of basic structural rough by this point in time, and I'm now moving on to doing a little bit more of a refined rough, still the rough stage. I initially drew her eyes a little bit too low down, so the great thing with digital is instead of having to redraw the eyes, I just simply move them up a few millimeters. If you are working on paper, of course you're going to have to erase those eyes and just redraw them a little higher. But otherwise the fundamental theories remain the same between mediums. I went for a very typical Japanese schoolgirl look with the collared shirt, the bow or the ribbon that is sometimes on the shirt, a jersey, and of course the skirt with pleats. And you'll see me flipping the canvas there just to get a good view of what the image looks like left and right, because your eyes get very used to looking at the image at one particular angle. And if you're working traditionally, the way to do that is to really use a mirror, and you look at your piece in a mirror and it gives you a different perspective. Look, you can see the image in reverse, and it helps you to spot some flaws that you didn't notice because your eyes was getting used to the image. I wanted to have a fun and joyful pose, a very cute pose, so I thought, well, maybe she's on her way to school, maybe it's the start of a new term, she's really excited to see her friends again. So that was really the spirit of the pose and the spirit of the character. She's very spunky and upbeat and a very happy character. And so here you see me adding a little bit of extra details, a little bit of extra outfits and accessories and things, just to flesh out her look. I initially drew the rough design of her left shoe bent, but I realized that wasn't really possible, so I changed in the refined design to just be normal. I stood up and did a few poses myself and looked at how my shoe bent when I was in that pose. So that's the beauty of having the rough stage and the refined stage, that you can go in and change things in the refined stage if you need to, if you feel that something in the rough stage has been messed up a little bit. But typically do try to get everything right in the rough stage. It makes the refined stage a lot faster and a lot easier to do. So what I'm doing now is lightening the line art, lightening the rough drawing. And I'm going in with a 2-pixel brush. This is an A3 size canvas, and I'm going with a 2-pixel ink and flatter brush, and the brushes are available in the course in the additional resources module. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to be as loose as possible and effectively one-stroking most of the lines to get a very smooth, quick, loose, and dynamic line. And I'm now going in and refining the piece. Typically, it's best to always make sure the character's head, face, and hair are done first and done well, because it really is the main focal point in terms of the composition of character pieces. And if that's done well, it makes the rest of the piece a lot easier to do and a lot easier to really make changes and fixes to the anatomy or other elements of the body if you know that you've done your very best with the head and the face and the eyes. Striving to be very, very loose here in the refinement of the hair. Long swooping lines, really using my elbow and my arm to get those lines nice and smooth and long. Also making sure I'm remembering to vary the size and the proportions of each of the strands of hair. Added a little bit of early line weights there to the bottom of her chin and going into her jawline just to separate it from the neck. And I'm going in and detailing those buttons and elements of her jersey. Regarding this particular art style, I find this particular art style very, very appealing. It's definitely mostly made up by myself, though I have no doubt that it exists in some manga or anime out there. I really like how glossy that particular eye design is, with the two highlights and a large portion of the iris itself covered by an abstracted or symbolic eyeshadow. Also take note of the amount of contrast on the eyes in this piece and in manga pieces in general, where the thickest lines in the piece usually will be in the eyes. And the thicker the lines, the more black there is in that area, the more contrast there is in that area between the black of the lines and the white of the page. And more contrast draws the viewer's attention to the focal points. And in this case, this is a good thing because the focal point is the head. Fortunately, in this piece, the hands weren't too much trouble. Like most artists, I struggle with hands, even though I've been drawing them for years. There really are such complex anatomical elements that sometimes you can really get stuck on drawing hands and arms and trying to figure out how things look in this or that perspective. But looks like I hit a good win in this instance. Keeping the bag design fairly simple, a carry bag, no strap, perhaps it's leather bound, opens at the top and lets you put your books in pretty easily. And also a nice simple design for the jersey. And you can see how the elements really take into consideration the 3D forms, how the dress the skirt wraps around the legs, how the jersey wraps around the forms of the torso. In this particular illustration, I didn't really have any reference for the pose itself, and it actually turned out pretty nicely. Although it's not too much of a dynamic pose, you could take things a lot further, but I didn't want to go too complicated in this particular piece. There you can see me changing the shoe's bend, putting on a normal kind of angle of the shoe rather than having the toe bend like that. The bottom toe bending makes sense on the foot on the ground because she's of course on her tippy toes, but it just didn't make sense on her left leg. And then for some extra cuteness, I had added in the ribbons there, and I treat clothing very much like hair, being very loose and being very, very flowy. And now moving on to the line weighting stage, doing the thick lines where necessary, filling in a few gaps where I'd missed important lines. And I think I'd realized at my line weighting stage I'd forgotten some of the details on the jersey, so I went in and quickly drew those in. Then apart from thickening up certain lines where necessary, I then also go in and do a lot of hook shadows. You can see me doing it in the hair. And this is really critical in this particular stylization. Thin lines, not really using thick line weights to delineate overlaps, but rather using hook shadows to delineate overlaps. And when you eventually get to a coloring stage with this style of work, you'll see the thin lines really shine through because you don't have to deal with too thick lines overwhelming the color of the piece. And still adding a few line weights here and there and a few hook shadows here and there. And that really is the end of the line weighting, and I go and do the soft line effect. And then to end, I go and do the eye shading, and that is the end of the demo.